You're watching a 31-year-old office worker drive his wife across Washington to ask a foreign country for asylum. It's the morning of the 21st of November, 1985. He is an American citizen born in Galveston, Texas. He is a civilian analyst for the United States Navy. He works in a secure building in Suitland, Maryland, and his assigned patch of the world is North America and the Eastern Caribbean. 3 days ago, federal agents stopped him at the door of that building with classified documents in his hands. Behind his car, at a careful distance, is an FBI surveillance team that has been with him for 2 days. Ahead of him is the gate of the Israeli embassy. He is not driving to an enemy. That is the thing that will make this case unforgivable to some people and unbearable to others for the next 35 years. He is driving to a friend, to the embassy of a country the United States arms, funds, and defends. For 17 months, he has been carrying classified American documents out of that building in Suitland and handing them to Israeli intelligence officers. At his sentencing, a federal prosecutor will describe the total by measuring it, a volume of classified documents 10 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. He has been paid $2,500 a month. He rolls up to the gate. A security officer walks toward the car. To understand how an American intelligence analyst ended up begging an allied embassy to hide him from his own government, you have to understand 3 things in order: what he actually took, who actually asked for it, and why, 30 years later, the United States still could not agree on what it cost. Because that is the part nobody expects. The spying took 1.5 years. The argument about the spying took 3 decades, split 2 administrations, cost a CIA director his temper, and produced 2 of the strangest sentences ever spoken about the same defendant by the same man. Start with the 2 sentences. In 2011, 18 retired United States senators signed a letter making a factual claim that nobody has successfully disputed. Jonathan Pollard is the only person in the history of the United States to receive a life sentence for passing classified information to an ally. And in the same era, 4 former directors of Naval Intelligence, William Studeman, Sumner Shapiro, John Butts, and Thomas Brooks, put their names to a rebuttal with 1 line in it that the other side has never been able to wave away. Some of the data he compromised, they wrote, had nothing to do with Israeli security or even with the Middle East. He betrayed worldwide intelligence data, including sources and methods. Both of those statements are true. That is the whole problem. He was born on the 7th of August, 1954, in Galveston and raised in South Bend, Indiana, where his father, Morris, taught microbiology at the University of Notre Dame. By his own later account, written for a judge, he started dreaming about immigrating to Israel at the age of 12, in the summer of 1967, when Israel won a war in 6 days. In 1971, he spent 3 months at a science camp there, a program, he wrote, that pushed its teenagers hard toward immigration. He came home with something else too. On that trip, he ended up in hospital after a fight, and he left behind a reputation as a troublemaker. Then Stanford, 1972 to 1976. He earned a 3.5 grade point average, which is the part everyone agrees on. What the CIA's own damage assessment recorded years later came from classmates interviewed by federal investigators. That he bragged about being a Mossad agent, and that on one occasion he waved a pistol in the air and screamed that everyone was out to get him. He was not a Mossad agent. He was a 19-year-old undergraduate telling a story. The story would take another decade to become true. In 1979, he applied for a CIA graduate fellowship and was turned down. The reason was in the polygraph. He admitted drug use, recent enough to disqualify him on the spot. The Central Intelligence Agency looked at Jonathan Pollard and said no. Later that same year, the United States Navy said yes. On the 19th of September, 1979, he was hired by the Navy Field Operational Intelligence Office as an intelligence specialist working Soviet issues. He lasted roughly 2 months before doing something that should have ended his career on the spot. He walked in on Richard Haver, the technical director of the Navy's Ocean Surveillance Intelligence Center, and proposed opening a private back channel to South African intelligence. To sell the idea, he claimed his father had worked with the CIA in South Africa. His father was a microbiologist in Indiana. Haver asked for him to be fired. He was overruled. The proposal climbed high enough to reach Rear Admiral Sumner Shapiro, the commander of Naval Intelligence Command, who took one look, dismissed Pollard as a kook, and ordered his clearances revoked. Shapiro would say the rest of it out loud years later, after everything. "I wish the hell I'd fired him." Here is what happened to that revocation order. Nothing. Pollard transferred to a different job, and the order was neglected, and the paperwork went into a drawer, and he kept his access. That is not a rumor. That is in the CIA's assessment of its own community's failure. And then he got better at the job. Because the second half of this is genuinely awkward for everyone who later called him a bumbler. He was good. Over 6 years, he was promoted from GS-7 to GS-12. He had graduate study at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts on his record, real analytic ability, and outstanding performance appraisals. A later polygraph came back inconclusive, but it shook out admissions of false statements, past drug use, and unauthorized contacts with foreign officials. In 1982, after a psychiatrist found no mental illness, his clearance was upgraded to the highest compartmented level. The CIA's post-mortem explained the trick in one bloodless phrase. He survived, it said, because of deficiencies in administrative procedures and record-keeping, since rectified, that allowed him to change jobs without the bad parts of his history reaching his new supervisors. Every time he moved, he got a clean slate. He moved a lot. In October 1984, he arrived at the Anti-Terrorist Alert Center in Suitland, Maryland, a watch floor with access to almost everything, where his personal responsibility was North America and the Eastern Caribbean. Remember that patch of the map. It is the detail that eventually hangs him. But by October 1984, he was already 4 months into it. It began in the summer, through a family friend, a pro-Israel activist who had known the Pollards for years and who made an introduction. The man on the other end of that introduction was Colonel Aviem Sella. Sella was not a spy. Sella was a war hero. He was the Israeli Air Force officer who planned the 1981 raid that destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor, and he shot down Syrian MiGs over Lebanon in 1982. In 1984, he was on study leave in the United States, taking computer science at New York University, which is roughly the espionage equivalent of finding a Formula One driver working weekends at a rental counter. Pollard told him what he did for a living. Then he offered. Sella did not say yes. Sella picked up a telephone and called Air Force Intelligence in Tel Aviv, and the call climbed, switched upward until it reached the Israeli Air Force Chief of Staff himself. The instruction that came back down was careful and correct. Develop the contact slowly, because this could easily be an FBI dangle, a trap. A volunteer who walks in offering national defense information is the oldest bait in counterintelligence. Sella was told to take his time. 10 days later, Pollard arrived with a briefcase. There were at least 3 meetings between June and August of 1984. Sella set up a contact system, a Hebrew letter assigned to each digit of a phone number, so a message could be passed in the open. He picked Pollard up at the Washington Hilton and drove him. And his early requests were specific in a way that tells you exactly what Israel wanted first: classified material on Saudi Arabia, and one photograph, an aerial image of the bomb damage at Osirak, the reactor Sella himself had put a hole in 3 years earlier. Hold on to that photograph. It comes back at the very end of this story, and it is the strangest single object in the case. At the third meeting, Sella told Pollard he would have to travel to Europe to meet the people who actually ran this. Paris was agreed. The trip would be reimbursed on arrival. And there was one more instruction, the one that tells you Israel was not treating him as a hobbyist. Bring your latest Navy leave and earnings statement. They wanted to see his payslip before they set his price. The 8th, 9th, and commencement of November 1984. 3 days in Paris. The cover story had already been built. Ann Henderson, the 24-year-old woman Pollard was seeing, who would become his wife, was told the holiday was being paid for by a wealthy relative called Uncle Joe Fisher. Uncle Joe Fisher did not exist. A letter from him would later be composed to accompany a gift. In a Paris meeting room, Pollard met the two men who now owned him. Joseph Yager, who went by Yossi, was counselor for scientific affairs at the Israeli consulate in New York, and he took over from Sella immediately, with both new handlers warning Pollard to stop all operational contact with the war hero. The other man was Raphael Eitan, Rafi. If you want one line to explain the weight in that room, 24 years earlier, Rafi Eitan had led the Mossad team that grabbed Adolf Eichmann off a street in Buenos Aires and got him to Jerusalem to stand trial. Now, he was counterterrorism advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir and the head of LACOM, the Bureau of Scientific Relations, a compact scientific and technical intelligence unit that answered to the Defense Ministry rather than to Mossad. Over 3 days, Eitan and Yager did 4 things. They set his salary, $1,500 a month. The CIA's assessment notes, dryly, that this was roughly his Navy take-home pay after tax. They bought a diamond and sapphire ring for Ann Henderson to be presented as an engagement present. They told him that if he was ever ordered to take a polygraph, he should resign from Naval Intelligence rather than sit for it. And they gave him the shopping list, 6 categories in descending order of priority, recorded by the CIA in the order Pollard gave them: Arab and Pakistani nuclear intelligence, Arab exotic weaponry, including chemical and biological weapons, Soviet aircraft, Soviet air defenses, Soviet air-to-air and air-to-surface missiles, Arab order of battle, deployments, and readiness. Yager summarized the mission in one sentence: the best available American intelligence on Israel's Arab adversaries and on the Soviet military support behind them. And the CIA's damage assessment contains a heading that the defenders of this case have leaned on ever since. The heading reads, "What the Israelis did not ask for." Underneath it, the agency recorded that they never expressed interest in U.S. military activities, plans, capabilities, or equipment. Israel asked for intelligence about its enemies, not about America. Except that Eitan added 2 items to the list that were about nobody's enemies at all. He asked for material containing dirt on Israeli political figures, and he asked for anything that would identify Israeli officials who were secretly providing information to the United States, which is worth stopping on for 1 second. The head of the unit was using an American analyst to hunt for Israelis who were talking to Americans. In December, Pollard collected the ring and the fake letter from the uncle who did not exist at a house on Deborah Street in Potomac, Maryland. Yager told him that from now on, every meeting would happen at an apartment on Van Ness Street in Northwest Washington. Then Yager handed him a key, which brings us to the 22nd of January, 1985. And the only part of this story that is a physical feat. By then, Pollard had been accumulating documents for weeks. That afternoon and evening, he went into his workspace at the Anti-Terrorist Alert Center to collect all of it, and it took him 4 to 5 hours to get it out to his car, because it filled 5 suitcases. He did not sneak. He could not sneak. The volume made sneaking impossible. So he told the security guard he was moving material to another building for an ongoing project, and he walked out with a load, and came back, and walked out with another. And the guard, this is recorded in the CIA's own footnote in the flat language of an institution describing its own wound, the guard, to save the bother of readmitting him after every trip, propped the door open so that Pollard could come and go freely. Nobody searched him. He held a courier card, and a courier card is a piece of plastic that says this man is authorized to carry classified material out of the building without inspection. According to the investigators who put the case together, he was using it around 3 times a week. He took the 5 suitcases home and kept them overnight. He made the delivery on the 23rd of January, a date on which government records show him signed out on sick leave. At the Van Ness Street apartment, he was met by Yager and by a woman who lived there, Irit Erb, a secretary at the Israeli embassy. The assessment records Yager's reaction in 4 words. He expressed amazement at the volume. Then came the elegant part. Some of Pollard's documents were accountable, logged, numbered, and expected back in a government repository. Those were carried into another room, copied, and handed back to him, so he could return them to their shelves and nobody would ever notice they had been out of the building. And they set a schedule, which he then kept for 10 months. Every other Friday, a delivery. The last Saturday of every month, a tasking meeting with Yager, several hours long. Erb would telephone to tell him when the copied documents were ready for collection, usually that Saturday or Sunday. A few months in, they upgraded. The Israelis rented a second apartment in the same building, and that second apartment contained nothing but copying equipment. Sometimes Pollard could now sit and wait while his documents were duplicated in the room next door. Picture the building. One apartment with a woman living in it. One apartment with nothing in it but photocopiers. In February 1985, his pay went from $1,500 a month to $2,500. The reason is on the record. The Israelis were appreciative of the quantity and quality of what he was bringing them, and the raise came shortly after the 5-suitcase delivery. He got a performance bonus. And in October, 5,000 miles away, the material did something visible. Israeli aircraft flew to Tunisia and bombed the headquarters of the Palestine Liberation Organization outside Tunis. The strike killed dozens of people. It required knowing precisely where the compound was and precisely how the Tunisian and Libyan air defenses worked on the way in. The CIA's damage assessment, under its heading on foreign policy interest, records Pollard's role in providing Israel with intelligence that assisted the planning of that raid. That is the one moment in this case where you can point at an event on a map and say, this is what the suitcases were for. The rest of the subject matter, drawn from the same assessment, reads like an index of the region's nightmares. Iraqi and Syrian chemical weapons production with satellite imagery, Soviet arms shipments to Syria, Arab and North African naval forces, port facilities, communications lines, the specifications of the MiG-29, Pakistan's nuclear program, and one item that does not belong on a list of Israel's enemies at all, an American assessment of Israeli military capabilities. He handed Israel the file America kept on Israel. And here the record splits, because this is the point where the two sides of the Pollard argument stop describing the same event. The CIA's damage assessment counts approximately 800 published classified documents, running from unclassified up through top secret and compartmented material, plus an estimated 1,500 current intelligence summary messages pulled from 3 daily products covering the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. The prosecution measured it as furniture. Assistant U.S. Attorney Charles Leeper told the sentencing court that the defendant had admitted selling Israel a volume of classified documents 10 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. Pollard himself, describing it to a reporter, said the stack would be 6 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 10 feet high. And Ronald Olive, the Naval Investigative Service counterintelligence supervisor who ran the case and later wrote a book about it, put the figure at more than 1 million pages. Those are not 3 versions of one number. Those are 3 different claims. And the gap between 800 documents and 1 million pages is the gap the entire 30-year fight was conducted inside. Nobody has ever reconciled them in public because most of the underlying paperwork is still classified. What is not disputed is the character of some of what went out. Journalist Seymour Hersh, working sources across the intelligence community, identified 4 American systems as compromised. A year's worth of daily fleet surveillance reports out of Rota, Spain. The Defense Intelligence Agency's computerized retrieval system. The National SIG-INT requirements list. The priority tasking sheet that tells NSA's collection units around the world what to listen to. And the RACIN. RACIN stands for Radio Signal Notations. It was a 10-volume National Security Agency manual listing the physical parameters of every radio signal the United States was intercepting anywhere on Earth. One communications intelligence officer called it the Bible. It was not a document about Arab armies. It was a document about how America listens to everybody, including the Soviet Union. Pollard got an out-of-date copy out of the Office of Naval Intelligence library. That single item is the reason a life sentence became thinkable. Everything up to here was material Israel had asked for. What comes next is the material nobody asked for at all. Because the CIA's own assessment makes a judgment about Pollard that cuts against him harder than anything Weinberger ever wrote. It concluded that while he responded effectively to the general Israeli taskings, he himself exerted the strongest influence on what was compromised, by virtue of his own access, his own interests, and his own collection initiatives. Meaning, a large part of what left that building left because Jonathan Pollard decided it should. And this is where his prosecutors argued the Allied defense collapses. According to the 4 former directors of naval intelligence, he offered classified information to 3 other countries before he ever worked for Israel, and to a 4th while he was working for Israel. According to Olive's account, he passed classified material to South Africa, tried more than once through a third party to sell classified information to Pakistan, repeatedly disclosed data marked no foreign access to a Royal Australian Navy exchange officer, handed classified economic and political analysis to 2 acquaintances who were professional investment advisors in the hope of future business, and took documents on China because his wife's public relations firm had a Chinese client. Say the honest thing about this list. Much of it rests on Olive's book and on the Admiral's letter, and Pollard has disputed it for decades. What is confirmed in the CIA's own file is narrower, the South Africa proposal, and unauthorized disclosures during an earlier assignment. But even the narrow version is fatal to the simplest version of his defense. Because you cannot be a man who spied for one country out of loyalty if you were also shopping for others. In July and August of 1985, he flew out for his second and final operational trip. They met in Tel Aviv, in a secure area of Beilinson Hospital, because Rafi Eitan was recovering from eye surgery. Eitan had a computerized listing which Pollard believed contained everything he had delivered to date. He went through it, complimented Pollard, and told him the material had been crucial to the security of Israel and had far exceeded expectations. Pollard noticed that one item was missing from the list, the Osiris photograph. The first thing Sella ever asked him for. It had never been logged into the system at all, and Pollard's own conclusion, given to investigators later, was that Sella had simply kept it. Personal memorabilia, a souvenir of his own airstrike. Then Eitan laid out the future, and the future was where it broke. There would be a Swiss bank account in the name Danny Cohen, Pollard's new Israeli identity. Israel would deposit $30,000 into it every year. Israeli passports would be prepared for him and his wife, and he would continue spying for 10 years, at the end of which he would immigrate with $300,000 waiting for him to start a new life. Pollard was, by his own account, badly shaken. It was the first he had heard of 10 years. He had already been thinking about stopping. The final meeting of that trip lasted 15 to 20 minutes, and it was a confrontation. Pollard said he was worried about being caught, and that a decade was unreasonable. Eitan, in the assessment's phrasing, appeared very angry. He repeated that Pollard had nothing to worry about, and that the Swiss account should settle his nerves. And then he turned to Yager and told him to give the man a couple of thousand more for his expenses. Yager handed over roughly $12,000. In the Swiss account, Yager did open it. Withdrawals required Yager's counter-signature, and not $1 was ever deposited in it before the arrest. Across the entire operation, the money Jonathan Pollard actually received came to about $45,000. On the 9th of August, in the middle of that trip, he married Anne Henderson in a civil ceremony in Venice. There is one more thing from those debriefings, and it is the coldest detail in the file. Asked what he would have done if he had never been caught, Pollard told his interrogators he had been intending to resign from Naval Intelligence and get himself hired by the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research for one specific reason. At INR, he would not have been required to take a polygraph. Major intelligence products were sitting there in the open, and he said something else. At State, he believed, he could have taken a less risky role. He used a phrase that has a precise meaning in the trade, an agent of influence. Not a man stealing documents, a man shaping decisions. Investigators never established whether he had discussed that idea with the Israelis at all. Then he flew home into a building that had changed while he was away. In May 1985, the FBI had rolled up the Walker-Whitworth ring, a Navy spy network that had been selling to the Soviets for the better part of 2 decades. The result was a security clampdown across the entire government, and it was worst exactly where Pollard worked, inside Naval Intelligence. Everyone's habits were suddenly interesting. The CIA's assessment guesses this is why he was close to alarmed in that Tel Aviv hospital room. And in the autumn, the officer in charge of the Anti-Terrorist Alert Center started to wonder about him, not because of anything clever, because of the patch of the map. Pollard's job was North America and the Eastern Caribbean, and Pollard kept handling large amounts of classified material about the Middle East, which had nothing whatever to do with it. The officer in charge began watching him more closely. On the 25th of October, 1985, a coworker went to that officer and reported that he had seen Pollard apparently removing classified material from the center without authorization. The officer checked, confirmed it, and telephoned the Counterintelligence Directorate of the Naval Investigative Service. NIS opened a case. NIS called the FBI. And then, over the following weeks, they watched him do it again. Some accounts date the decisive report to Friday, the 8th of November, and describe a colleague seeing him carry a bundle out to his wife's car. The CIA's file gives the 25th of October. It is possible both happened. What is certain is that from late October onward, the man with the courier card was being counted. He made his last delivery on Friday, the 15th of November. He had 3 days left. Now, before the last 3 days, let's do something honest. If this were a film, the ending is already written, and it is a clean one. 19 months from now, Jonathan Pollard will sit down with federal prosecutors and sign a plea agreement. He will admit everything. He will cooperate completely, for months, with the FBI, the Navy, and the CIA, and they will confirm he did. And in exchange, the United States government will promise, in writing, not to ask the court for the maximum sentence. That is the resolution. Guilty man, full confession, negotiated deal, case closed. Remember that document because it is the most important piece of paper in this story, and it is going to be worth absolutely nothing. The 18th of November, 1985. FBI and NIS agents stopped Jonathan Pollard as he walked out of the ATAC building in Suitland with classified material in his hands that he had no authorization to remove. He gave them a story. He was delivering it to another US intelligence organization for consultation. They checked. It was false. So he gave them a second story. It was for a journalist he knew, Kurt Lobeck, who was interested in helping the Afghan Mujahideen. Investigators looked at Lobeck too and found he had nothing to do with the espionage at all. And then, having caught a man red-handed with material he had no right to hold, having watched his first explanation collapse and his second explanation collapse, they let him go home. The questioning ran 3 days. 3 days, and each night he went home. He used them. Early in that 3-day window, Jonathan Pollard picked up a telephone and warned Yossi Yagor. Then he went back in and fed his interrogators false information. The CIA's assessment states the consequence in a single sentence. He thereby gave Yagor, Erb, and Sella time to flee the country. Meanwhile, Ann Henderson Pollard was getting the signal at home. The code word was cactus. It meant trouble, and it meant move. She started clearing the apartment. She could not do it alone, so she asked a neighbor for help. And the neighbor, a Navy officer, ended up holding a suitcase of classified documents that reportedly weighed 70 pounds. He carried it for a while. Then he did what a Navy officer does when he realizes what is in his hands. He telephoned military intelligence and asked for advice. He cooperated completely afterwards. He was never charged. And here is the part that explains why he was still walking around loose. When the FBI searched the Pollard's apartment, they found only the handful of documents Ann had missed. That was enough to prove a man had removed classified material he had no right to remove. It was not enough to prove he had given it to a foreign government. They had a thief. They did not yet have a spy. No handler had been photographed taking delivery. No money had been traced. Yagor, Erb, and Sela were still in the country and still unidentified, and the entire purpose of leaving Pollard on the street was to watch him walk to one of them, which is the precise reason the case very nearly died. For those 3 days, the Bureau's best evidence was a man with a full briefcase and 2 bad alibis. And then, by several accounts, asked by his own superiors to sit for a polygraph, Pollard admitted he had been passing documents illegally. He did not say to whom. On the 19th, Pollard was placed under 24-hour surveillance with 2 objectives: identify his real contacts and stop him leaving the country. By the night of the 20th, the people he had spent 17 months serving were already packing their bags, and Jonathan Pollard, an American with a courier card and a wife and no passport that worked, had run out of stories. So on the morning of the 21st, he drove to the gate, the Israeli embassy in Northwest Washington. Ambassador Thomas Pickering, describing it afterwards, said Pollard panicked and tried to drive into the basement of the embassy to seek refuge. A security officer refused to let them in. They were ordered off the property, and the moment their car came off embassy ground, off the little rectangle of foreign soil where American law does not reach, the FBI took them both. 17 months of work for the State of Israel, and the State of Israel would not open a gate for him. Within roughly 24 hours, the Israelis were gone. Sela and his wife went to London by way of a train to New York. Yagor went to Canada. Irit Erb went to Mexico. Science attaché Ilan Ravid went to Miami and then out. Not one of them ever stood in an American courtroom. And nearly 30 years later, in 2014, Rafi Eitan gave an interview that reframed the entire scene at that gate. He said he had known in advance that the arrest was coming, that he had alerted Prime Minister Shimon Peres and Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and that he had sent Pollard a prearranged signal to get out of the United States. Pollard, he said, wandered around for 3 days under surveillance instead of obeying it, and the guard at the gate? Eitan said he had given that order himself. Asked whether Israeli officials had known about the espionage, he answered in 2 words: of course, which matters, because for more than a decade, Israel's official position was the opposite, that this had been a rogue operation nobody authorized. That position held until May 1998, when Prime Minister Netanyahu finally acknowledged Pollard had been an Israeli agent answering to Lacam. A U.S. delegation flew to Israel to retrieve the stolen documents. Among them were the State Department's legal advisor, Abraham Sofer, and prosecutor Joseph DeGeneva. What they got back, by press accounts, was a few dozen of the less sensitive documents. American participants later described the trip: meetings that began at 11 at night, blacked-out buses, translation into Hebrew for rooms in which everyone spoke fluent English. Commander Jerry Agee, the Naval Intelligence officer who had driven the investigation, was told by Israeli airport security that he would never be coming back, and found items missing from his luggage. Ambassador Samuel Lewis summed the whole affair up as the most unprofessional espionage case he had ever encountered. Then came the plea agreement, the clean ending that wasn't. In June 1986, Pollard pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to deliver national defense information to a foreign government, and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to receive embezzled government property and to being an accessory after the fact. In return for full cooperation, the government undertook not to seek the maximum, life for him, 10 years for her. There were 2 other clauses. Neither of the Pollards was to say anything public about the case without the approval of the Director of Naval Intelligence, and a breach by either one of them would void the other's deal. In court, Pollard said the right thing, and he said it well. His actions could not, under any stretch of the imagination, excuse or justify the violation of the law, particularly one involving the trust of government. He had broken trust. He had ruined and disgraced his family. Then, on the 20th of November 1986, he sat down in Petersburg Penitentiary for a jailhouse interview with a Jerusalem Post correspondent named Wolf Blitzer, without Justice Department approval, and, according to press accounts, without telling his own lawyer. He told Blitzer the gains to Israel's long-term security had been worth the risks. The interview ran in installments. On the 15th of February 1987, 3 weeks before sentencing, the Washington Post carried it under a headline that has to be read as a confession of vanity. Pollard, not a bumbler, but Israel's master spy. His defense attorney, Richard Hybe, on learning of it, is reported to have made a sound loud enough that colleagues came to check on him. And on the 1st of March, 3 days before sentencing, Ann Henderson Pollard appeared on 60 Minutes and told Mike Wallace that she felt she and her husband had done what they were expected to do, and what their moral obligation was as Jews. She said she had no regrets. The plea agreement required remorse. The clause said either spouse could void it. The prosecutor, Joseph D. Geneva, drew his own conclusion out loud. Pollard was a very dangerous man, which is when the Secretary of Defense walked into the file. Caspar Weinberger submitted a 46-page classified damage assessment memorandum. Then, on the 3rd of March, 1987, the day before sentencing, he filed a supplemental declaration. From his January declaration, Pollard had jeopardized the sources of that information by placing it outside of a U.S.-controlled security environment, and U.S. combat forces, wherever they are deployed in this world, could be unacceptably endangered through successful exploitation of this data. From the supplemental filing, one sentence that ended the argument in that courtroom. It is difficult for me, even in the so-called Year of the Spy, to conceive of a greater harm to national security than that caused by the defendant. And then the line his lawyers would spend the next 20 years calling a breach of contract. The punishment imposed should reflect the perfidy of the individual's actions, the magnitude of the treason committed, and the needs of national security. The government had promised not to ask for life. It never used the word. It did not have to. Also, on the 3rd of March, 1987, in Israel, Aviam Sela, indicted in absentia on 3 counts of espionage and safely beyond extradition, was given command of Tel Naf Air Base. The man who recruited Pollard got an air base the day before Pollard got sentenced. The 4th of March, 1987, Chief Judge Aubrey Robinson Jr. gave Jonathan Pollard life imprisonment and got 2 concurrent 5-year terms. Press accounts describe her collapsing in the courtroom. Under the rules of the time, life meant he would not be considered for parole for 30 years. The U.S. Congress noticed the airbase. Faced with threats to cut aid, Sela resigned the Tel Naf command on the 30th of March and was quietly reassigned as an instructor at Israel's National Security College. And here, the record splits again, this time inside the same man. In 2002, 15 years after filing the declaration that produced a life sentence, Caspar Weinberger described the case in an interview using these words. The Pollard matter was comparatively minor. It was made far bigger than its actual importance. That sentence is the hinge of the next 3 decades, because it comes from the one person who had read everything. The campaign that followed was unlike anything in American espionage history. On one side, Henry Kissinger, who wrote to President Obama that justice would be served by commuting the sentence. George Shultz, who wrote the same. Michael Mukasey, a former attorney general who had spent 18 years as a federal judge and pointed out that he had imposed life sentences on exactly 4 defendants, 2 murderers and 2 terrorists, and that Pollard's offense did not nearly approach any of those. James Woolsey, a former CIA director who had opposed clemency in the 90s and publicly reversed himself, arguing that people should pretend Pollard was Greek or Korean or Filipino-American and free him. And a federal appeals judge, Stephen Williams, dissenting from his own court's refusal to hear Pollard's habeas petition, a refusal made on the procedural ground that his original lawyers had never filed a timely appeal, who wrote that the life sentence represented a fundamental miscarriage of justice. On the other side, 7 former secretaries of defense opposing clemency together: Rumsfeld, Laird, Carlucci, Cheney, Weinberger, Schlesinger, Richardson. The 4 directors of naval intelligence and their line about worldwide intelligence data, sources, and methods, and Sumner Shapiro, the admiral who had tried to fire him in 1979, saying the part almost nobody else could have said better. 9. Saying the part almost nobody else would say, that Jewish Americans work so hard to establish themselves and to have somebody wreck it, and then to have Jewish organizations line up behind this man and try to make him a hero of the Jewish people, bothered the hell out of him. In October 1998, at the Y River negotiations, Netanyahu tried to make an agreement with Yasser Arafat contingent on Pollard's release. His own account: "If we signed an agreement with Arafat, I expected a pardon for Pollard." President Clinton tentatively agreed, and the American intelligence community responded with what participants described as unequivocal anger. CIA Director George Tenet threatened to resign. Pollard stayed in prison. And underneath all of it ran the accusations that made compromise impossible, that Pollard's documents reached Moscow. So let's be precise, because this is the single most repeated claim in the case, and it has never been proven. The CIA's damage assessment does not say the material reached the Soviet Union. It raises it as a risk that documents revealing sources and methods might find their way to Moscow through a Soviet penetration of the Israeli intelligence or defense community, a vulnerability, not a finding. Hirsch reported that a number of officials strongly suspected Israel repackaged Pollard's material and traded it to the Soviets in exchange for continued permission for Jews to immigrate. He also reported, in the same breath, that those officials stressed they had no hard evidence, no smoking gun, no document from an Israeli or a Soviet archive. He wrote that CIA Director William Casey had claimed the Israelis used Pollard to get America's war plan against the Soviet Union. All of it. He also wrote that Robert Gates, then deputy director, disputed Casey's certainty. 40 years on, there is no public proof that a single page went to Moscow. There is also no way to rule it out. That is not a satisfying answer. It is the accurate one. And there is one more thing the record will not settle. Weinberger's 46-page memorandum, the document that produced the only life sentence ever handed down in America for spying for an ally, has never been fully released. No lawyer of Pollard's has seen the sealed portion since 1987. The fight was never resolved. It was simply outlasted. On the 20th of November 2015, at the first moment the law allowed, Jonathan Pollard walked out of the federal prison at Butner, North Carolina, after 30 years. He was 61. He came out into a set of conditions: a GPS device on his ankle at all times, any computer he touched subject to monitoring and inspection, a curfew keeping him in his New York home from 7 at night to 7 in the morning, and a prohibition on leaving the United States for 5 years. His lawyers, Elliot Lauer and Jacques Simmelman, filed a habeas petition within hours of his release, arguing the terms were illegal, that the ankle monitor aggravated his diabetes and forced him to violate Shabbat. The courts refused. In 2016, senior figures from the American intelligence community petitioned to keep the conditions exactly as they were. He served all 5 years. On the 20th of November 2020, the parole expired and every restriction fell away at once. 6 weeks later, on the 30th of December, a Boeing 737 registered N108MS, owned by a company of the casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, lifted off from Newark. When it landed at Ben Gurion, Jonathan Pollard came down the steps and kissed the ground. Prime Minister Netanyahu met him on the tarmac and handed him and his wife Esther their Israeli identity cards. "We are ecstatic," Pollard said, "to be home at last after 35 years." 3 weeks after that, on the morning of the 20th of January 2021, in the last half day of his presidency, Donald Trump granted a full pardon to Aviam Sella at Israel's request. Sella never spent an hour in an American court. Rafi Eitan was never charged, became an Israeli cabinet minister, and died in 2019 at 92. Yager, Erb, and Ravid were never touched. Anne served 3.5 years, was divorced by Pollard almost at once, and was found in 2010 living in New York in dire condition. She says Israel abandoned her. Esther Pollard, who campaigned 22 years and once starved 19 days for him, died in 2022. Weinberger died in 2006, 4 years after calling the case comparatively minor. Shapiro, who tried to fire him in 1979, died in 2005. Judge Robinson died in 2000. Morris Pollard died in 2011. His son was refused permission to attend the funeral. The memorandum is still sealed. And the very first thing Israel ever asked Jonathan Pollard for, the aerial photograph of the reactor Aviam Sella had bombed, is the one item in the whole case that was never logged, never returned, and never accounted for. It never entered the operation at all. A colonel kept it as a souvenir of himself. Everyone else made their flight out in November 1985. His took 35 years.